All right, guys, Murphs here. And today we're going to talk about the PDW concept. Talk about some of its development history, as well as what I consider to be currently some of the best examples of not just the use of the concept, but also weapon systems that are fantastic in the pursuit of that concept. Now, first off, what's a PDW? What's it stand for? Well, that is a personal defense weapon. And traditionally, a personal defense weapon is a weapon system used by personnel who might be involved in frontline fighting, but their primary purpose is not shooting people in the face. They have some other sort of specialized task that puts them on the front line, still have a requirement to be able to defend themselves. However, they are not a rifleman as much as they are a radio operator or something along those lines. You also see the PDW weapon, personal defense weapon. Yeah, that happened. The personal defense weapon concept represented in kind of personal security type aspects. And we'll talk about that as well as we go through this. Now, as long as there have been militaries with specialized tasks or with component branches or personnel who have specialized tasks, there have been personal defense weapons in some form. They weren't always called that, but that's what they were. So if you even go all the way back to ancient times with archers, it would not make a lot of sense to give an archer a spear or pike or a halberd, something along those lines. Does that make any sense? Their purpose is to be behind the line of troops, sending arrows at the advancing enemy, picking away at their numbers before battle is actually met along the front lines. So the pikes need to be at the front, the archers need to be in the rear. However, in case somehow the enemy breaks through or there's, some sort of like pincer move or something like that, the archers might find themselves fighting. And contrary to some pop culture references like, Lord of the Rings and all that kind of stuff, fighting with a bow at close range is not that easy, especially if it's a long bow or a crossbow. So you're not necessarily going to run around and run and gun with a bow like it's the AR-15 of its time. Once the battle gets very close, you're going to need to switch to a hand weapon. So a lot of these guys would wind up outfitting themselves with like short swords, small axes, daggers, something along that line. So at the very least, they could fight their way out of whatever situation that they found themselves in. And you would see the same type of thing show up in firearms as they came along, as gunpowder gets developed and more military start using different types of firearms. And then eventually we get into the 19th and 20th centuries and all those types of things. And conflicts as this develops, we get more as this, as militaries develop and more technology starts hitting the battlefield, we get more and more personnel with specialized tasks. So take World War I, for example. You have a bunch of guys who do things other than just shoot people in the face. You now have an engineer corps who's supposed to be running around building things or maintaining trenches, all that kind of stuff. You have artillery manning their howitzers behind the front lines, still very vital and might wind up fighting, but they don't necessarily need the main infantry rifle. It's too long, it's too big, all that kind of stuff, too heavy, and it doesn't really match with their purpose. And it would take rifles from the front to supply those guys in the rear with the same type of weapon system. You also have cavalry, which though their purpose is to shoot people in the face, they have to handle a horse while they do it. So they don't necessarily benefit from having a full-sized rifle. So at this time, what you see developed are a lot of, the carbines and short rifle concepts and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, they're kind of cut down service rifles, or at the very least, they're rifles perhaps better adapted for whoever it is who's actually using them, bayonets, foregone, or different, stacking swivels and all that kind of stuff associated with them. But they're still chambered in the same cartridge as the full-size military arm. Now, that's fantastic from a supply type standpoint. You don't have to take up space with two different types of cartridges circulating out to the front lines or to wherever to be able to resupply these guys. However, you're not getting any advantages by going with a full power rifle cartridge in a cut down rifle. What you wind up with is a lot of lost velocity, increased muzzle blast, increased muzzle flash, as well as more recoil, and a still rather heavy weapon system overall. So while it's better than not having a rifle, it's not as good as having something that's actually purpose-built. We'll get into that here in a little bit. Now, your absolute rear echelon guys, like your quartermasters, they do not have rifles at all. These guys are just armed with handguns at best. And that's because they are nowhere near the fighting, and there's no expectation that they would be anywhere near the fighting. Now, in the interwar period, we see things start to change because post-World War I, we see more and more mechanization coming into the militaries. We see more and more of a modular military concept to where it's not necessarily like battle comes down to the company level as much as you can maneuver platoons and even all the way down to the squad level, different aspects of developing the overall combat space. So you can move squads or platoons wherever it is that you need to in order to be able to make effective combat with the enemy, because now we've been able to take a lot of weapon systems that previously would have required an entire company to run them, like machine guns, and have made them small and lightweight enough to be transportable by a squad that has other purposes other than being a machine gun squad. You can have riflemen, you can have all these different types of guys combined in the same unit and then be able to maneuver them around the battlefield appropriately. So now, again, with that mechanization, you now have tanks, you have trucks, and all this kind of stuff. You need people to be able to fight those. So now you have mortarmen are starting to come into the platoon level, as well as anti-tank guys with like rocket launchers and all that kind of stuff, so that they can defeat these different types of threats. Well, these guys now have heavy things that they have to carry. You have communications are now getting all the way down to the platoon level with radios and all that kind of stuff. That guy has to carry a radio, anything that's required to keep the radio maintained, his own sustainment, and then also the full-sized infantry arm of the time. That's a lot of weight. And from a modular concept to being able to quickly maneuver around the battlefield and all this kind of stuff, you're fighting yourself on that prospect if that guy has to carry the same rifle as a dude who just has to worry about shooting people in the face. So the rifleman at this time, he's got a rifle, he's got his ammunition for his rifle, he's got whatever sustainment type aspects that he's got with him and any comfort items that he wants. So that's not a whole lot of weight when you then go up to a guy who has to carry a mortar base plate as well as that same rifle, ammunition, mortar ammunition, his sustainment, and any comfort items that he wants as well. You can kind of see where we got a weight disparity. And now that guy is slowing down everybody because he's pulling more weight than is necessary. Now, militaries would address this in a couple of different ways. Some militaries would go over to more heavy use on submachine guns. I want to look specifically at the United States military on this one because we take a very different path than everyone else, and I think it was definitely better as history would show us. So submachine guns at this time, for the most part, getting into World War II, we're still looking at what are referred to as Generation 1 submachine guns. And these are wood and steel, machined receivers and all that kind of stuff. They have a layout more akin to a rifle, highly adjustable sights for outrageous distances for a pistol caliber. And the idea behind the development of this style, this Generation 1 submachine gun, was really to be like a lighter, more portable machine gun, kind of utilized in the same sort of suppressive fire type sense. Now, going into World War II, we start to see the Generation 2 submachine guns, which are more stamped steel, very lightweight, very rapid production, not terribly reliable and definitely disposable, but highly producible. And there's a dynamic to be struck there. However, at the end of the day, you're still fighting with a pistol caliber cartridge. Nobody wants to go to war with a pistol cartridge if they can avoid it. It's much preferred to have a rifle for the distance and the power and the terminal ballistics and all that kind of stuff. Now, in addition to that, when you look at the United States military, as we are right now, right before World War II, we're talking about the M1 Thompson. That's an incredibly heavy weapon system. It is just as heavy as any rifle. So it's not really helping, your bazooka men out by giving him a submachine gun. He's still got a lot of weight he's got to carry and a really heavy and kind of ineffective weapon system at that point. It also doesn't make any sense to give him M1 Garand or a 1903 Springfield. So how do you solve this problem? Now, also, another aspect that we need to look at right now is with this modular warfare, the Germans wind up unveiling the Blitzkrieg tactic. And this completely changes the progression of warfare at this point and how your assessment of your safety, if you can call it that, on the battlefield really goes. Because now the enemy can punch a hole deep into your lines and sweep right through the front lines, get through into the rear echelon units to where now they're attacking ammo supply points or different supply activities and logistic activities and stuff like that. And if those guys are just armed with handguns up against the average German infantry platoon that has MG42s, they're screwed. They are not going to win. Not even slightly. They're not going to even be able to effectively defend themselves, because in 1911, against the German squad, I would not pick that. So,
Now everyone in the United States military is really wanting to get a better armament for these rear echelon types, as well as these frontline guys who aren't necessarily doing rifleman tasks, and see if they can get them something that works better for this. Now, the US would first develop a cartridge because any attempts to do this, to build a more lightweight weapon system towards the 5-pound threshold in the 30-06 was not working out. So what they wind up doing is they develop a all-new cartridge that is built entirely around a couple of different specifications that would pair well with a lightweight rifle. So they were looking for 2,000 feet per second out of the muzzle, 30 caliber, and able to reach out to 300 yards. And what they got was the 30 carbine cartridge, previously reviewed on this channel, link in the description. After establishing the cartridge, they would then go after the rifle, which would bring them this, the M1 carbine. Also, this one specifically previously reviewed on the channel. So this weapon system would be fielded to rear echelon types, and then also these guys with other functions out on the battlefield, and it would become fairly popular for being a lightweight and easily portable, very handy little rifle. Now, it would also wind up finding its way circulating into the hands of riflemen, because as it turns out, everyone has an interest in a lightweight rifle whenever they have to walk with it. And this is something that I find kind of interesting whenever people debate the pros and cons of like being very specific about choosing lightweight options, because you can kind of tell who's had to carry stuff a great distance and who hasn't had to. Now, there's a definite dynamic to be struck between good weight and bad weight, and you know, be it cost or durability and stuff like that. There's a lot of things you got to take into consideration. But at the end of the day, if you have to carry something a long way and basically live out of a backpack for a while, you have a very different assessment for how that weight carries and how much you feel like that weight is actually doing anything for you when you're out walking 20, 30 miles in a day and all that kind of stuff. You can see where an M1 carbine would start to become a very enticing option to a lot of frontline troops. Now, moving forward into the 50s and the Cold War and all this kind of stuff, we'd see a couple of interesting changes occur with the PDW concept. So we go from the M1 carbine, which is our first true PDW, and we go to the M14, because the United States military decides that they can replace all weapon systems in the M14. Submachine guns, the BAR, the M1 Garand, and the M1 carbine can all be wrapped up into the M14. And of course, it does not perform any one of these weapon systems functions well. And this concept is quickly abandoned. The M16 is adopted. And you don't really see a lot more moves made with PDWs at this time. The M16 is fairly lightweight, and it seems to be just kind of like, well, suck it up and do what you need to do. However, there would be M16 carbines that would be developed during this time that would be utilized by special forces. So it's not like the concept went away entirely, as much as it just wasn't being heavily leaned upon. Now, if you look over at the Soviet bloc, they would take a little bit of a different approach and kind of redefinition of what a personal defense weapon is. So at this point, you're now looking at, for the most part, submachine guns are really holding sway in the former Soviet bloc. So you see things like machine pistols, which are favored by officers. And the idea here is that you have a handgun that you can utilize in handgun type manners, and then also be able to attach like a wire stock, flip it over, adjust your selector to full auto, and be able to press it into service as a submachine gun. So machine pistols like the Stechkin would be a fantastic example of this concept. And it's kind of, to me, to a certain extent, it's going too far down the rabbit hole of submachine gun in this case. However, you would also see other weapon systems like the BZ-61, which I have an incredible soft spot for. It's an absolutely excellent weapon system, as well as the, I believe it was the PMD-63. I'll annotate down below appropriately if I got that nomenclature wrong for what I'm picturing. It's a Polish submachine gun. Now, you would also see a couple of updates made to the AK-47 as well, in attempts to make it a little bit smaller and better suited to people working out of armored personnel carriers or tanks. So first, guys would go with folding stocks, and of course, folding stocks aren't necessarily the best shooting platform there is out there. And then you would have adaptations like the Hungarian AMD, which would have a little bit shorter barrel and all this kind of stuff and be fantastic for tank crews. And eventually, we would get the Krinkov style AK weapon systems, a short carbine type setup, favored by special forces as well as aircraft crews, like in helicopters and all that kind of stuff. Now, in the American, I guess you could say, civilian market, specifically looking at law enforcement, you see the heavy use of submachine guns, and that's kind of a PDW prospect if you want to look at it that way. But I think really where we see it is in personal security detachments, like for the president and all that kind of stuff. Submachine guns start to become very popular because it's a compact amount of very fast firepower that you can get into the fight. Now, you see this with like the Uzis as we move up into the 70s and the 80s and all this kind of stuff. Those get adopted and utilized quite heavily by different security teams all around the world in order to, yes, you're using it's a pistol cartridge. However, it's more firepower than what you'll get out of a handgun. So there's a dynamic to be struck there. Now, once we get into the 90s, we see an interesting adaptation, and this would be the FNP-90 submachine gun chambered in 5.7 by 28 millimeter. And this was interesting because this was a necked casing and a Spitzer type bolt. It's like little mini rifle rounds shoved into a pistol type platform. And the P90 being able to fire these little pointed bullets at 900 feet per second and them having a light armor defeat capability suddenly makes this a very interesting PDW option. Now, the P90 would not necessarily gain a lot of military contracts. However, it has been used extensively by security teams all over the world in combination with the FN57 pistol, chambered in the same cartridge, which has a 20-round standard flush fit magazine and a 30-round extendable, the P90 having a 50-round helical magazine, by the way. And these weapon systems have been heavily leaned upon by security teams to this day. Now, also going along with the same kind of necked Spitzer type bullet, you have the HK MP7, excellent little submachine gun. I would love to see one hit American shores, but we'll probably never see it. Now, moving into the 2000s, we start to see more and more popularity of M16 carbines like the M4. And more, we see the trend move towards rifle calibers in very short packages, short barrels, down to 10.5 of the Mark 18. You know, you have the short barrel G36K, all these types of things. It's what a lot more of like special forces are starting to lean on in order to have a more compact overall weapons system, especially when combined with suppressor, where you're still getting rifle ballistics. This is where submachine guns start to fall off, because who really wants to fight a war or fight any battle with a handgun cartridge when you can have a rifle? Especially since, yes, you lose a lot of velocity and you gain a lot of blast, and muzzle flash, all that kind of stuff whenever it is that you go to a short-barreled rifle. However, you also still maintain higher velocities and better performance at the same distances that you would be engaging with a handgun round. There's a dynamic to be struck there. Now, at this point, let's go ahead and discuss from a professional sense what are excellent choices in a PDW weapon system. When I look across what is available on the market right now for a professional sense, so say private military contractor or a PSD or something like that. Well, if you're going to be actually fighting as a contractor overseas or conducting personal defense for high-value personnel in far-flung, perhaps war-torn locations, I would highly recommend short-barreled rifles, just to be able to have that greater overall distance and performance while having maybe a cartridge that is still very common in the region. I would suggest a short-barreled rifle. Now, if your professional sense is more in the terms of a personal security detachment in a established, stable country, I would recommend submachine guns for the most part. Definitely the more compact, the better. That way you still have a higher rate of fire than what you'll get out of a handgun. You can effectively suppress an opponent in order to be able to get your principal out of the line of fire, which is kind of your major goal here. Your intent is not to have to sit there and duke it out, and your fights are probably going to be fairly close to where a handgun cartridge will still be fairly effective for what it is that you're trying to do. Now, and by the way, the P90 and the FN57 would be excellent choices for this purely based upon their armor defeat capability. That's a definite plus, especially when you combine it with 900 rounds a minute if you can get a hold of that. Now, for the average person, where do I think PDW concepts come in at? Well, this is trying to get a portable weapon system that gives you greater firepower that perhaps you travel with quite frequently. As you go about your day, you keep a backpack with you that happens to have a weapon system that collapses down to be small enough to fit into it. There's a couple of things that help do this. You can, of course, do ultra short setups like I have on this 300 Blackout short-barreled rifle that I built. This collapses down to an exceedingly small overall length and fits very well in a bag, and it's something that if I needed to get greater firepower into a fight, I could rely on this. And I'm a huge fan of using a handgun to get myself to a better cartridge. And that's kind of where this would come in right now. I can see people assessing this in a lot of different ways. So you can go with these super short PDW setups. There's a lot of different manufacturers out there who produce them. This is from Strike Industries. And you can get ultra short rifles. For that purpose, I recommend the 300 Blackout when you go ultra short. I recommend remaining with a rifle cartridge so that you get that greater velocity and internal effect. And I highly discourage the use of pistol cartridges. A lot of like your AR9s or maybe SP5, something along those lines. I discourage those uses. As much as I find them very interesting, I wouldn't mind having some. At the end of the day, all I'm doing is giving myself a third point of contact to be able to work with the weapon system. That's helpful, but it's not that helpful, especially when you don't have full auto to be able to associate with those things. So at least you can establish a lot of firepower and keep their heads down while you maneuver your way into either a better position or out of the fight entirely. Might be a little bit questionable if the average civilian all of a sudden opens up with a full auto Uzi though. So keep that in mind while you're at it. Whereas short-barreled rifles like this work exceedingly effectively in these close-range encounters with rifle bullets. That's kind of how I assess that overall. That's the decision that I made on my PDW. Now, another weapon system that kind of falls in this PDW category is this IWI X95 Tavor. Now, this has a 16-inch barrel, and it's really not that short of a gun overall. However, it is 26.125 inches long, which makes it much shorter than your average AR-15. So this might be a really awesome option for you if you have a vehicle platform that you can take it around in. If you consistently work from a vehicle, this might be something that you take into account to have available for you so that you can fight your way to a better weapon system, or you can get into the fight with a larger weapon system. Just something to consider overall there, guys. All right, guys, that's pretty much what I have on this concept. I hope you guys found this interesting. And also, these two rifles, if I didn't mention before, have been previously reviewed on the channel. So, I think that's pretty much what I got for right now, guys. So, have a good day.